The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning everyone and welcome, and thank you for joining us today for this NZLS CLE webinar, CPD Reflective Practice. My name is Ken Trass and I'm today's moderator. Now we have two presenters, Neil Gold from the Faculty of Law, University of Windsor, all the way from Canada, and sitting across from me, Christine Grice, the Executive Director, NZLS here in Wellington. Now the runtime for the webinar is around 1.5 hours. That includes time at the end for questions. Now there won't be a break in the webinar, and if you need to pop out during the broadcast, that's fine. You'll be able to catch up on any missed parts via the archived copy. Now at the end of the webinar, I'll tell you how to access this. You will have already received an email with a copy of the PowerPoints and an electronic booklet to be used today. Your microphones are muted during the presentation, so background noises don't interfere with the webinar broadcast. We encourage you to participate in the webinar by sending in questions during the broadcast, and I'll now explain how to do this. You should now see the webinar toolbar slide. If your control panel is a small box on the right-hand side of your screen with 3 icons going down, click on the orange arrow to expand your control panel to full size. Now that your control panel is expanded, you can use the orange button to show or hide that control panel as you wish. If you would like to permanently show the expanded control panel, you will see 3 menu options on the top right of your screen. Click on the View menu. On the drop-down menu, make sure that the Auto Hide Control Panel option is unticked. To ask questions during the webinar, you will need to enter your questions into the area near the bottom of your control panel called Enter a Question for Staff. Presenters will answer as many questions as time allows. Thank you to those of you who have already sent in questions this morning. Once again, I thank you for joining us today, and I'll now pass you over to Christine Grice. Christine.
Tēnā koutou, and welcome to everyone participating in today's session. Ko Christine Grice au, ko Professor Neil Gold ia. Neil is an emeritus professor of law at the University of Windsor, where he's lectured and based his research for well over 40 years. Professor Gold has been involved in the design and implementation of legal training for many of those years and has had a close association with New Zealand and Australia. He was in fact the author of the Gold Report, which was commissioned by the Law Society and the Council of Legal Education, which led to the introduction of the pre-admission training course and requirements in 1987. This was a significant watershed for New Zealand legal training. He's regarded as an international leader in the design and development of legal education, and many of you will remember Neil from the seminars he presented around the country when CPD was first introduced a few years ago. Today, Neil is beaming in from Vancouver in Canada, where it is last night in a cool winter's day, apparently 7 to 8 degrees, sounds like summer in Wellington. Ken Trass, who will also be assisting and answering some of the hard questions, is the Professional Development Manager at the New Zealand Law Society. Ken's background is in education. He was a secondary school deputy principal for many years and has held various roles in leadership in the education sector. He's worked on the development of the New Zealand Education Council, and presently in his spare time he provides mentoring for school senior managers on development and curriculum design. The webinar is also supported by Brian Kwan at the Continuing Legal Education of British Columbia and the New Zealand Law Society CLEs, people who are also in the room. Ko Christine Grice ingoa. My main role these days is as Executive Director of the New Zealand Law Society. I have a long background in the law. I spent 35 years primarily as a litigation lawyer, a partner at Harkness Henry, where I led and managed a lot of lawyers during the time I was there. My practice evolved and changed drastically over those years, from doing a bit of everything, conveyancing and general litigation and family, crime and trusts, to concentrating mainly on commercial litigation and insolvency law. Latterly, I became heavily involved in mediation, arbitration and corporate governance, as well as sitting as a judge in the Cook Islands. So I've done quite a few things, and I like to keep my hand in, mainly in corporate governance and judicial work. So I need to focus on those areas and keep my skills up, as well as the skills that I need and the law that I need for my role at the New Zealand Law Society. So with that introduction, let's get underway. First, we'll have a quick recap of the CPD rules, and for this I'll hand over to Ken.
Well, hello again, everyone. So the CPD rules really were constructed around one thing and one thing only, and that's you. It's to build on the culture of learning that's already well established in the law profession, and really to be lawyer focused, to be flexible enough to give you an ability to choose what is going to be most important for you as a lawyer as you go through your career. Now, CPD has a structure, and there are some things that, of course, will be familiar to you about that structure on this slide. To highlight, though, CPD is meant to be planned and purposeful. The activities you undertake to have an element of interaction and feedback, either with colleagues or the presenters of any activities. And yes, there is a yearly declaration to do after the end of the CPD year, which of course runs through to the 31st of March each year. Each lawyer, of course, maintains a CPD plan and makes a declaration to say that that is complete. Now, a minor thing, although still part of the rules, is around making a declaration to say that you've verified that you've done activities, and this is also part of the CPD-PR, or your plan and record. Now, this is ongoing, and as part of this plan, you record your activities, and most importantly, your reflections on the activities and what it means in relation to your learning needs. That's a quick recap on the basics of the rules, and of course, more information, including a full guide around the CPD rules, can be found on the Law Society website, and you can access this at any time. Now it's time to head back to the main body of the presentation today, and I'd like to hand over to Neil at this stage. Neil.
Well, thank you very much, Ken. It's great to hear your voice, and lovely to have heard yours, Christine. Thank you very much, Christine, for the wonderful introduction. And Ken, thank you very much for reminding all of us listening in today about the intention and requirements of the CPD rules. So you folks listening to this may not realize, but it's Monday afternoon here in Vancouver, middle of winter, about 7 degrees, and you're, as always, ahead of me there in New Zealand. As Ken mentioned, the CPD rules are structured with a high degree of professional trust and professional autonomy. That's exactly the right thing to do with experienced professionals. At their heart, the CPD rules are centered around lawyers planning for and reflecting on their own learning. The individual is entirely responsible for identifying needs and designing the program to meet them. I consider this to be an extremely progressive approach to continuing professional development, in which New Zealand is clearly one of the leaders in the world's legal profession. It's always important to review and strengthen programs such as this one. Last year, 2016, the New Zealand Law Society asked practitioners for their views on the CPD scheme. Feedback from this provided a useful resource for examining how to approach the two main components of the continuing professional development plan and record: the identification of appropriate learning goals and the components of reflective practice statements. Those were identified by practitioners as the most useful. In this webinar, we'll present some ideas about how to get the most out of your plan and record using practitioner examples. We'll explore what other lawyers have done in relation to planning and reflective components of the CPD PR, and what we think the benefits are of the examples provided by colleagues in the New Zealand legal profession. Every profession has a continuing learning obligation for its members. It's in the public interest that quality professional services require that we pay attention to the quality of legal service. In law, it's an expectation that lawyers act competently. Maintaining competence is very much grounded in continuing professional development. However, in fact, a focus on learning aims to improve the quality of professional practice for both the benefit of practitioner and the client. Simply put, more efficient and more effective practice pays off in many ways for everyone. I'd like to turn to what we're hoping to accomplish here today and to look at the objectives we have. What we're aiming for is that practitioners recognize the importance of identifying their own individual learning needs. Second, we want to help practitioners understand how reflective practice in learning can help them to improve their practice. Third, we want to identify what makes a good reflective statement a good reflective process. Finally, almost finally, we want you to learn to reflect intentionally at 3 different junctures: before, during, and after continuing professional development. And this is where reflection occurs as planning, as thinking and reflecting while you're learning, and finally, considering what you've learned and how it helps you. The CPDPR wants you to record the reflective steps taken when learning to show that you did this intentionally.
Thanks, Neil. It's important to highlight the value that CPD can provide for us lawyers. Some of us do still have concerns about the time that it takes, and it does cost, both from a time and money point of view. So this can be a barrier for many of us. I know that in a busy working day with clients demanding attention, as well as all the other competing demands, the CPD requirement goes to the bottom of the pile. In some ways, we've been asking the profession to accept the value of CPD in a planned and structured way on faith, saying, trust us, you'll benefit from this. Now, this is quite a hard sell. However, at the same time, I'm hearing from a lot of lawyers who say that, much to their surprise, CPD has really helped them. Many of them are embracing and benefiting from structured CPD in ways that we had not anticipated, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they're saying, as well as hearing your comments, Neil, on how we can support the long-term value of CPD.
Well, thanks very much, Christine. It will be important to draw those elements together. I know that some of our participants today may recall I was in New Zealand a couple of years ago. I had the wonderful opportunity to travel around the country from Whangarei to Dunedin and to visit lawyers in virtually every corner of the country between. And at the time, there were some consistent complaints, concerns expressed about the structure of the continuing professional development process. I understand that for some practitioners this has persisted. I worry a little bit that the CPD rules have a kind of edu-speak about them, you know, the jargon of educators, and that this has gotten in the way of giving CPD a chance, especially the use of such terms as reflective practice. As lawyers, we like our own jargon very much. It's professional. My point being, Christine, maybe we need to communicate more straightforwardly. Now, before preparing for this webinar, I think I was asked by you if I thought that New Zealand lawyers weren't reflective. And I have to say, from my experience with them on several occasions over many years, this just couldn't be farther from the truth. So this webinar is about reflecting the fact that New Zealand has a very active, thoughtful legal profession. We want to help lawyers get the most from each learning experience and ultimately to make every professional experience a learning experience. Learning from learning experience and learning from and through practice. In that way, we think competence will grow and excellence evolve personally for each practitioner over time. Now, Christine, you were suggesting to me that you were a bit stuck in your ways and somewhat resistant to change. So I guess you're going to be a tough customer to convince about the power of CPD. but I've never met anyone who couldn't learn to be better at some aspect of their work. So could I ask you to think about some part of your practice that you're not totally satisfied with? And while you're doing that, let's look at some New Zealand lawyers' comments about the benefits of the CPD process.
I'm interested now, 2 years into CPD, if you've thought about any benefits of CPD to you as a practitioner or to the wider profession.
Well, it's helped immensely. The Chinese law community felt a little isolated as we were only talking amongst ourselves. I know I felt a bit lost. We've been forced together, and this has enabled a range of collegial contact that we didn't used to have. The formalisation of CPD is, in my mind, connecting us a bit more and more equitably. It's not just the same few attending courses.
So aside from this collegial contact, which is a very interesting point, has the CPD scheme made you consider the place and value of learning more than before?
I think that CPD, by its very design, is asking us to engage with learning and asking us to examine ourselves and ask, what is the purpose of the learning and why am I doing this?
The example that you've just heard struck both Christine and me as a surprise and something we could also have predicted. Here's what I mean. Bringing people together to find a solution is itself both a learning approach and an outcome that will support learning. We all know the benefits of establishing a network and of the benefits of networking. This is central to learning from school days through to professional practice. Sharing concerns and questions with peers and working out pathways of learning or approaches to finding solutions is invaluable. It provokes questions, stimulates ways of thinking about searching for answers. Let's hear more from our New Zealand practitioners.
So in terms of your professional learning, what value have you got?
In the past, I did a lot of seminars, but I didn't have any framework. I would just go to a course and put the folder in storage and never think about it. I now have to think about what I'm doing and why I did the learning, which means I'm now more conscious of applying my learning to my practice of law, rather than letting those thoughts gather dust in a cupboard like some of the CPD folders used to.
Here's a reference our participants may find useful on the topic of learning in groups, and one of the things we'd like participants to do is begin to think about where they can go to learn about learning and support their learning, and this is a great example. Some may remember the movie The Paper Chase. Others will have had this experience of studying and discussing issues in small groups of peers who are struggling with similar or same questions. This process is engaging. It focuses on the problems, shares learning and perspectives, and builds understanding, insight, and knowledge. It's a powerful tool that can be used in the law firm, over a meal with colleagues, at a CPD event with or without a leader or facilitator. So there's a reference there for everyone at Michigan State University, and we'll hope you'll have a look at it. So here's a template a practitioner could adopt in working and learning with and from others. 1, when did you last interact with a practitioner for CPD? What were the benefits of this interaction? Why do you feel it is important to have a diverse approach to your learning interactions? How does it help you to vary the way in which you go about learning and the persons with whom you engage in that learning process? And finally, for now, how do you use networking opportunities to enhance your own continuing professional development? Do you take advantage of the people you know, the people they know, and the opportunities of bringing them together?
Because I now have to reflect, I actually need to engage with the impact or lack of impact in some instances on learning. This really helps how I work. Reflecting has also helped align my needs. I now think I have a better sense of what I need to learn next, where the gaps or the next learning steps are. I can then identify where I can go or need to go to get help.
My personal view is that CPD and the CPD PR has been hugely successful. and that it is now second nature to constantly consider where my shortcomings lie and what I need to learn in order to improve. When attending a seminar, it is now also an immediate reaction to pause and reflect on the value of the learning. Whether I'm typical or not, I don't know, but I suspect I am. For me, this is a definite change.
Well, Neil, it sounds like you've actually written those comments. So let's just consider what that last lawyer is doing. She says instead of just listening or just hearing what's said, she instinctively now pauses and reflects on the value of what she's heard. But what does she actually mean by reflecting on the value of what she's heard? How do you actually do that?
Well, it's pretty simple, really. CPD has now shifted my focus more outwardly. I'm no longer seeing my work as isolated. I think for me, when I said I'm now just reflecting automatically on my work, I mean I'm now not just doing stuff, but I'm taking time to think about how I did it and why. I'm also thinking about who's affected by what and how I do my work and how I'll be perceived. I think before CPD, I wasn't taking time to consciously think about this, even though I was probably doing it. I think there is value in all of us taking time to consider what we could do better and why.
So what do you mean by value?
I mean that if I take time to think about learning and how we are practicing, we then uncover the gaps. This means we end up being smarter in the way we approach our clients. I think that some of the lawyers I talk to are still approaching CPD as a transactional exercise, thinking about just completing the CPD points, rather than thinking about how it could change how they work.
So this lawyer has certainly gone beyond the inputs and is now focused on improvement from what she takes away from those learning sessions or the consequences. I think I can safely say that a lawyer who cares about the consequences of her work is really going places. Clients will benefit, and she's likely to do very well in her career.
Yeah, I think that's right, Christine. I mean, this lawyer has learned a powerfully useful approach because she was asked to think about what she did and whether it was useful, how she did it, whether it was effective and efficient, and more significantly, she shows that she cares about her client is affected by what she's done, the consequences of the legal work. There's a lot going on there. Think about what she did, whether it was useful, how she did it, whether it was effective and efficient, and then finally demonstrate that you care about how the client is affected by the legal process in which she or he is engaged. This is a professionally responsible lawyer practice. It's a sign that the lawyer cares about her client and what the effect of the legal services was. This is an ethical response and one we would hope every solicitor would seek to practice. And so what we can learn through this process is to practice in a much more professional and I would say ethical way. Here's another comment we received. Having to think about my learning has been the single biggest influence on me as a lawyer since I began practicing in the late 80s. I was intrigued by this and asked the lawyer what was meant by this.
I must say, I wasn't a big fan of CPD. I really did see it as just another thing to do. I guess I was one of those older lawyers out there who just couldn't be bothered with recording what I'd been doing for years anyway. And what changed my mind is that I realised that I hadn't really been reflecting on my learning at all. I was initially really annoyed that I wouldn't be in a position to count my professional reading. I spent hours, of course, reading updates of law, materials supporting my files, but it dawned on me when I could not count this as CPD that actually it was doing nothing for me aside from supporting my actual work. What I mean by this is that everything I was calling professional development was actually file completion work. My CPD only really began when I suddenly had to think about what my needs were. I think this is what I meant when I commented to you that thinking about me and my learning has been a big influence on me.
So is it important to take time out to think about your learning needs?
Hugely, but it's still a pain. But over the last year, I guess, I've started to plan out in my week about 20 minutes to stop and write in my CPD planner. This was important because I think if I hadn't done this, I wouldn't have bothered. Setting aside time to do my CPD record has made me think about the why of my learning rather than just what I'm doing. This why am I doing it, or why is this important, is now making me think about how I do things. That's been hugely valuable.
So, if I've heard this correctly, you've moved through answering the question why you do something to the instrumental question of how to do it. So, what do you mean when you say that's been hugely valuable?
In terms of value, I'm looking for application. I guess I'm asking myself, is this new learning going to mean that I can do things faster, better, and be more confident with my new piece of legislation? I'm finding myself thinking more about this to do with my interactions with clients and my team as a manager, thinking about how I could have done things differently. Interestingly enough, lately I've started to tell my team about these. We've had some pretty good discussion about this too. I think the value of this is I'm now reviewing how I am as well as what I'm doing. Maybe this isn't so different to what most lawyers are doing out there, but it's certainly different for me.
Christine, I find this very, very interesting because this is a practitioner who's beginning to think hard, to reflect, what have I learned? How will this affect my legal practice? How can I do it better? We have a number of items I think we can summarize now about what our colleagues in the New Zealand legal profession have talked with us about. First, and there are about 6 points here, the formalization of CPD is connecting practitioners, creating networks, giving opportunities for people to get together and learn from each other. By its very design, it's asking lawyers to engage with learning, causing them to ask the question, what's the purpose of this learning? Why am I doing it? What's it good for? It's not just a matter of going to a session and soaking it up. It's going to a session with intent to improve the legal practice, the thinking of that particular individual as she ponders her own specific legal practice dilemmas. Third, one practitioner said she was taking time to think about how she did whatever it was she did and why. She's also thinking about who is affected by it and how she does her work and how she'd be perceived. These are all important aspects. What's the output? What's the effect? And how will I be perceived? All important things for the practitioner on different levels. The quality of legal practice, the influence on the client's well-being, and the output for the practitioner and her reputation. Fourth, reflecting has helped learning needs, what a person needs to learn next, where the gaps are, what next learning steps are. It helps identify where to go and get help. If you don't know what your problems are, you don't know what your learning gaps are, what your needs for professional practice are, you're not going to be able to fill them through any form of learning except randomly and serendipitously. Fifth, as one person said, my CPD only really began when I suddenly had to think about what my needs were. Yeah, I'm going with a purpose, with intent, to learn to meet my needs. Practitioners uncover the gaps to being smarter in the way they approach clients is the sixth point. And of course, that's just it. We're not learning for learning's sake, although there's nothing wrong with that, but we're learning for the sake of the improvement of professional practice, competence, and excellence.
Well, thanks, Neil. I also found the next interview spotted an interesting spin-off benefit. It offers a look at what a lawyer got from the planning process using an in-house group as the learning cycle or learning circle.
I think CPD has legitimised the voice of my team members as individuals and learners who want to be performing. They are now in a position to know what they can bring, need to learn, and can add to the overall goals of the organisation. CPD has also given some much-needed structure to how we approach learning.
What impact has this team approach to reflection and sharing learning had?
It enhances the knowledge of the team collectively. They come back and share. We push each other on what our gaps in the knowledge or skill might be, and then we think about what we are needing to do as a team for our next steps. either with our learning plans or team approach to how we work. This is really different than before. It was, how was your learning? And they'd say, oh, good, I learned a lot. And that was where it was left. Now we are asking each other, why was it good? What is the impact of that? What are the trends with this, and how can we apply that? How did they make it work? So from a team point of view, and the point of view of value, we are now getting a shared understanding about learning. The knowledge doesn't just sit with one person.
That's interesting. They're reflecting not only on the fact of what was learnt, but the value of it and how it can be applied across the team. So not only are they benefiting from the learning, but they're getting real leverage from the primary investment in the learning.
So have you seen any other shifts in how the team is working as a result of these reflective CPD meetings?
Yes, we tend to ask more questions of ourselves. We just would get on and do things before, but now we tend to be saying, what do you think of this? Can you review this, please? I think that we are now more comfortable working together and sharing how we are working at a different, maybe deeper level than we were before CPD. I think the structure of CPD and the reflection and planning need has done this for us. Not saying that we didn't work well together before, just we communicate on a much more personal level now. I think the reflections offered a different way of thinking. They actually had to think about themselves rather than just specific pieces of law.
So that's interesting, Neil. They've got to think about themselves, not just a piece of work. They're reflecting using their own personal attributes. I guess that's what we're after, isn't it? So, Neil, you've indicated in the next slide that you need to take a look at what you're learning during the session, think about it, and then build on that. So it's quite circular. First, you identify your needs, and Neil, I'll turn over to you.
Then the gaps in the learning are specified. You set goals, specific goals, things you really need to know and why you need to know them, and find ways to achieve them through CPD. And then you ask yourself, what have you learned? What impact does this have on my client's needs and my ability to practice efficiently and effectively? It's really quite straightforward and achievable. It does require some careful thought. Now, research tells us that diversifying one's approach to learning can be hugely rewarding and beneficial from a business context. And this includes the people with whom you interact. So we've talked about this before, but I would like to reiterate the possibility of forming a study group and doing that within your organization or within a group of colleagues. It's easier than you think to do it and to pull people together, and it's the oldest tradition of the Inns of Court. That's the way in which barristers in the temple and elsewhere would bring themselves together and ask themselves questions so that they could begin to resolve some problems. And you have on this slide some support materials that you can go to at the Law Society CPD site. Now let's look at how to identify learning goals and then how to reflect upon them. And we're going to do that by looking at your own plan, Christine. So you're putting it all out there to the profession. This is all on you for a while. If you could kindly walk us through your CPD plan, how you approached it, and then I'll come back with some comments. Over to you, Christine.
Thanks, Neil. So I'm the guinea pig, possibly for what not to do, but that's a learning experience in itself. So first, I have to admit I'm very guilty of procrastinating the review of my plan. I recently did read some material about some steps that could be taken to try and get around that. It's a common problem among professionals and particularly lawyers, I know that. So I find that when I get round to having a bit of time that I put aside to do my CPD plan and review, I suddenly find something else that needs doing, including tidying my desk or responding to routine emails. But there's some good literature on this, and there's a good book called The Procrastination Equation by Dr. Piers Steele, which gives some useful techniques, and one of those has actually been reported on or used by one of people who gave some feedback earlier. And it suggests to actually schedule some time for review, perhaps 10 or 20 minutes once a month. Put it in your diary on, say, a Monday morning. And as well as that, for the general review, make sure that after every learning experience, whether it's a seminar or something you've read, you put in a few minutes straight after to reflect on that. Apparently that's a very good way to reinforce the learning. So the trick is to put it in your diary and stick to it. And that seems to work for me. I applied it, and I've certainly been a lot better than I was in the past. It'll take away a lot of the pressure as we come up to the end of the CPD year for me. I also tidy up how I was keeping my CPD records. I was keeping both a hard copy and a soft copy. Now I've moved to keeping only one record, and I keep that in the Sky. It's online, so I can access it from wherever I am. I use a CPD learning tool, which is free, an online tool for lawyers. There are lots of them out there, and a lot of firms have got their own, or businesses have got their own attached to their performance management or HR systems. I record in that not only my structured CPD but my non-credit CPD and keep all my notes together. So I've got some other accreditations that I need to keep up. They've got CPD requirements and I keep those there as well. I can cross-credit a few of those. So now I need to consider what areas of legal practice I need to keep up with. I have rather a portfolio career, so I've got a lot of areas that I need to, or I want to keep on top of, but I can't do it for everything. This is probably the same as for many lawyers. Even if you haven't got a diverse career at the moment, you'll be changing within the next 5 years. Changes are always coming, the law's always changing. Demand varies for various types of the law, so you need to be looking to the future and making sure you're watching the horizon so you're equipped to deal with these. I moved in my career from conveyancing and general litigation, family and trusts, through insolvency, commercial mediation, arbitration, insolvency, arbitration, and then into corporate governance. So everything feeds into the next thing. With my planning, I do need to stop for a moment and really sketch out my learning needs. I need to make sure that's in the context of my career at the moment and make sure everything's in alignment. As I said, I've got a range of interests and parts to my learning needs. So I need to consider what I focus on, or else I'm not going to achieve much at all. Now, my main areas of focus at the moment are corporate governance, adjudication, and mediation. But I also need to keep on top of legal developments, particularly concerning professional regulation. I need to keep an eye on the future in all of those areas when I'm planning for my learning. So I've had to connect all those bits and work out what my goals will be. This has been, I must say, a pretty fluid and iterative process. I think having done this webinar, I've got a bit more structure now. But in the Law Society brochure, the 10-step guide to completing your own CPDR, is available, and that walks you through this process in a more structured and detailed way as a step-by-step progression. It's not linear, but at least that gives you a framework. You've got a reference to this on the PowerPoints that you have received. So a good starting point for me was to think about my learning from last year, and I just found it quite useful to use a few simple questions. What did I actually do, and what did I do well? Some things I didn't do at all. How did I progress? So what did I not do, and why didn't I do that? And finally, what do I need to change that I haven't already adjusted? Is there anything I really need to add or subtract? So that's quite a discrete consideration and much more detailed than I would have done before I had to do this planning and reviewing. It helped me to define my areas of focus. I was conscious that I needed to choose only a few, not a scattergun approach, and ensure that that focus would be of value and interest to me in my career. So you can see that I've established some areas of focus. My primary focus immediately is general skills in Māori. This has been on my horizon for a while. I identified it as a learning need quite some time ago. It's connected to every part of my work and life. For instance, with my Law Society work, it's crucial. I also do work in the Cook Islands, and Te Reo will help me with my Cook Islands Māori. At the same time, across the board, the courts have increasingly emphasised the importance of tikanga and Te Reo. It's also important in other aspects such as corporate governance and in fact everything I do. So it also helps that I'm very interested in it. But learning a skill like this takes a lot of time and energy to do it properly and a lot of practice. I'd really like to achieve that. So I need to focus on it, and I'm going to make it central to my learning over the next few years. I can't ignore the black letter law requirements, of course. I've got to keep up with those. So I also need to make sure I'm aware of changes affecting corporate governance law and keep an eye on regulation, as well as maintaining my core skills. At present, there are a few things on regulation and corporate governance that are pretty important, like cyber security and anti-money laundering. So going back to my first learning objective, I need to sit down and identify what I hope to learn, at least for this year and into the future. That needs to be pretty specific and clear. I can't do it all at once. I've got to do one thing at a time. And ultimately, I'd like to master this, so I must accept that this is a first and faltering step. So last year I enrolled in an Introduction to Te Reo and Tikanga Māori course to develop my skills, and in that course it had some simple objectives which you'll see on the screen. And reflecting on those objectives, I realised that I certainly have got the basics of those objectives, but I haven't mastered them by any stretch of the imagination. And the reason that I haven't done that is, A, I don't know enough, so I need to do some more learning, but secondly, I didn't put it into practice enough, so I need to look at how I can do that in the future. So those reflections really helped me to consider some discrete issues that I needed to consider for the next year. And using those reflections, I understand that I want to be able to deliver a mihi. I want to demonstrate that I want to demonstrate that I can do it, so I need to put it in practice. I need to apply it wherever I can, and to succeed in this, I need to implement it in my day-to-day life, and that applies for all those other objectives that I have set out in my previous slide. So this certainly will reinforce the learning and make sure none of the time that I spend in my formal learning goes to waste. It will certainly focus me and take a bit of time. I need to schedule that. So as I said, I rate this as one of my most important learning needs for the coming year. If I don't do it now, I'll never do it. So turning to my learning outcomes or intentions on that topic, as I've said, just focusing on the mihi as opposed to beyond that at the moment. I want to be able to deliver a fluent mihi at meetings and indeed any appropriate gathering. Secondly, to participate in a variety of gatherings and know the relevant protocol. And to acquire a basic understanding of Te Reo incorporated into appropriate places throughout my working and personal life, as well as trying to get some mastery of written Māori. So looking for learning activities, I need to make sure that in order to record the CPD, for it to count as structured learning, I know they must be verifiable, provide for interaction and feedback, must be planned and structured with a stated purpose and outcome, related to my learning requirements and not part of my daily work. So looking around to see how I can achieve that, I look for a formal course, and so I propose enrolling in a course building on what I learnt last year, and I've isolated a couple of courses that I can do that in. The university offers some very good Te Reo courses during the lunch hour, but the one that I have identified as fitting in with my timetable is the local community education delivered by Wellington High School, which offers those courses in the evening, and that fits with my life at the moment. So I need to enroll in a formal course. I need to make sure that I go to all those lessons, so ensure that it's a time that suits. And I'd also need to put aside some self-directed study time, because I'm not going to get the benefit of those courses unless I do some homework, keep up with the coursework. And further down the track, I'd like to see what I could do to form a small study group of other lawyers who may be interested in studying te reo and tikanga Māori, and maybe we meet once a month over lunch or something like that. So as I said, I've identified a couple of options for learning, and they provide study which amounts to 2 hours in the classroom for 6 hours, so that's 12 hours for one term, and I think I can manage that. So once I've established my learning outcomes, which I'd referred to earlier, and is up on that slide, I'll know that I've achieved them once I can actually do those things. So I'm going to need to reflect back and look for opportunities where I can demonstrate my knowledge. Once I have done that, I'll reflect again on my plan, or this will be an ongoing process, of course, and see how well I've done. In particular, I'm going to need to make a mental note to put it into places, or to use it and practice it in places that perhaps I wouldn't have done so to date, for instance in mediations and formal presentations, to just make sure it's appropriate. So I should be able to establish my further learning needs once I've completed that. As I said earlier, I'd like to gain a degree of mastery, and I'm not going to be able to do that overnight, and I know that I need to practice in order to do that. So once I've completed my first term, I'll go back to my CPDR plan and reflect what went well and whether I have achieved those goals that I've set myself. I'm going to put a special diary entry in my calendar to do that at the end of term 1. So at the end of the year, when hopefully I have completed a few terms of te reo, I'll look back and see whether I have achieved the learning outcomes identified as the longer term outcomes in my plan. I'd look for outcomes for further professional development, or I'd look for opportunities for further professional development. And next, I need to consider whether I need to change the plan in light of these reflections, whether I have in fact achieved what I wanted to, or I need to adjust what I'm doing to do so. So this is a fairly messy and sort of iterative process. It's certainly not linear, and you'll see on this slide is the planning, reflection, selection, action type circular reflection and planning cycle. I've found that process very useful. So the second area that I identified is corporate governance. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this one, as I've followed much the same process for this, but this is an area that I've particularly concentrated on for the last 25 years, so I've got a good general knowledge of corporate law and practice, and ethics and professional responsibilities of directors, and I've also done quite a lot of work on skills, multidisciplinary skills on boards and group dynamics. So on this, I'm going to make sure I maintain my skill levels, and I need to keep up to date with changes. There'll be specialist topics of IT that I'll need to undertake, as well as I mentioned earlier, the anti-money laundering, and I also need to do some work on health and safety governance. So there's a bit of a scattergun there. Last year I did a cyber law webinar, and so I need to build on that. So the areas that I need attention on is keeping up to date in the general law, and I've identified a corporate governance intensive in June 2017 to do this. This is 6 hours. I'm also looking at an Institute of Directors conference that's available, but just need to see if that fits in with my schedule. I'm also looking at emerging issues. As I said, anti-money laundering for this year is one I want to concentrate on. And finally, the board dynamic skills, conflict resolution, negotiation, I need to look at. This is probably self-directed. I also keep a note of my self-directed study. So you'll see on the overheads just how I do that, the reflection. I do record the cases and articles I read and summarise them. I find that a really good way to reinforce learning, but I need to keep those somewhere that I can lay my hands on them and consider how I can share them with others. That's a very good way of reinforcing the learning. So finally, standing back, I need to consider how my learning that I've established aligns with my business goals or work requirements. And I certainly think it goes without saying that that is the case. Certainly with the Te Reo and corporate governance and the skills-based topics that I need to concentrate on. And after each of those learning events, I need to reflect on what I've done and what else I need to do. So you'll see the next slide refers to written reflections being best done immediately after learning. It reinforces the learning, and if you're anything like me, it's the last thing you want to do after going to a seminar or a study group, but I'm going to try and be a bit better with this because if you invest the time, you might as well get the best out of it. So revisiting your learning the next day, a week later, and a month later is something that would be a good idea for me to do. So on the skills building, again, not going to spend any time on that, but I have isolated one webinar, a free webinar that I think I'll do on unconscious bias in the workplace. That's something I need to do some work on and will affect everything I do, so that meets the criteria. So, turning to reflection, the planning cycle is just up there again. That's a very useful cycle. Neil, what do you think about that?
Well, that's a very helpful cycle, as you say, because it causes you to do three things, I think, at least. One is to think in terms of what you need to learn, what the benefit is to you, and how it fills a gap in your own learning. Secondly, you think about why you need to learn it. You provide your motivation and interest. Then you make a choice, take some steps, and then think about, well, what did I learn? What have I gained? What is there from this particular experience that I can use in my practice that is new, that is valuable, and that adds to what I know? And finally, think about, well, what's left? What do I still need to know and learn? So, it's great to see you use this planning cycle in your work, Christine, and I hope that more practitioners will take it up. These tools are very useful. They force a kind of orderly progress of thinking through, and this thinking through causes more thoughts to occur, of course. So let's think about reflection in your context and what you've been doing. I think, first of all, you're a very ambitious learner, Christine. You set out a course that is extensive and demanding. It's hard to be sure all of those things could be accomplished in the midst of the many obligations you have as executive director of the society, as a judge in the Cook Islands, as a person engaged in other aspects of practice. And so, part of my question is, can you do this much? Is it more than you can undertake? Not to say that you shouldn't be ambitious or shouldn't want to go in this direction, but is it realistic for the time being? And I understand that one of the main focuses for you is to really learn to be able to interact in Te Reo, Maori. I'm sorry for my pronunciation. I need some help with that. I think I'll put that on my CPD list. So it would be unusual for every aspect of planned learning to be learned, and you might want to also make a list of what you had planned and what you missed. It seems to me, Christine, you've learned a great deal, and that you need probably still to learn more. I mean, every time you identify what you've learned, you realize what you haven't learned. And to learn even more, I think you need to be able to work details into what you want to know and be able to do. For example, is managing a meeting, what are those key skills for that? Introducing topics, presenting in an orderly manner, maintaining logic, asking questions to clarify the meaning of an intervention, listening actively, summarizing periodically. Managing a meeting, as an example, is not that straightforward a matter, and the little skills that are necessary to piece together the ability to manage a meeting include being able to open the meeting, to deal with interventions, to put presentations forward, and to interact successfully with people who may not always have fully identified what they want to say. So let's also look at what you've done in regard to governance and your second learning need. So you've said, well, what do I do well? General knowledge of corporate law and practice. So I'd ask you to answer the question, what do you mean by general law? What are the components of it? Do you need a list, a checklist, a table of contents of a major work in the field? What are the ways in which you'd be able to tease out the contents in a sufficiently detailed way to know what you know and know what you need to know? It's just a general question. I want to be able to understand a field in general. No, you want to be able to understand what the field is, what its components are, and the various components as applied to your abilities. And what does it mean to know something? If I ask you a question about something, you'll be able to answer it. But in the context of corporate governance or meeting management, it's to be able to apply it in context and to engage in it specifically. So when we ask the question, well, what does it mean to know something? Is it to be able to repeat it, to be able to say it in your own words, or to apply it to a situation? And what I'm suggesting to Christine and to all of you listening is that you need to dig deeper, push harder, understand more specifically what it is you need to know and be able to do in order to demonstrate your mastery. You identified something about ethics and professional responsibilities of directors. What do you know? What are those ethics and responsibilities? Do you have a compendium somewhere of all of the responsibilities? How can you examine yourself to confirm what you know and what you don't know? What will get in the way of your being able to accomplish your goals? And are your goals frustrated by rules that require a certain behavior? The interaction of your goals in managing a group or a meeting or a process and the requirements of ethics in that context. So skills on promoting the functionality of boards and group discussions are complex, compound skills. When do you use which and why, for example? It's a matter of timing, of thinking it through, of reading the room, as they say. What does it mean to read the room? Are you watching for the nonverbal skills, nonverbal behavior, of the people in the room? Are you looking at the way in which they respond to what others say? Are you reading the way in which they express themselves? So how do you assess your ability to manage a meeting? What are the things you need to be able to do better in order to be able to guide the meeting to an appropriate conclusion? Finally, there are things such as board dynamics, the interaction of people that I've averted to, dealing with conflicts that arise. What's the role that you would have in dealing with those conflicts? Are you aiming to negotiate between parties at a meeting? Perhaps not. Making sure that the parties understand what the other is saying? Probably yes. Helping to move to identify points in common and those that diverge. These are all things you can do from the chair, and you need to think through them with great care. So what exactly do you need from each complex skill set? What is leadership? What are its characteristics in the context of leading a meeting? So there we have it. Do you think I've asked for too much? Have I been a little bit too pointed in what I'm suggesting here?
Wow, that's quite a hard ask, Neil. You're certainly a hard taskmaster. I thought I was on the right track. I'd read all the brochures and was following the cycle, but what you're asking is actually much harder. It requires a far more concentrated dig down. I've had a bit of a go at it. I don't think I'm there by any stretch of the imagination, but just looking at the questions you pose on corporate governance, how do I know I've got a good general knowledge? Well, one of the tools that I do have is teaching this from time to time. I know a syllabus, and I know that I need to keep absolutely up to date on all the topics in the syllabus. There's also a useful way of keeping up with the cases. I just keep an eye on the Decision New Zealand database, the courts database, and see what's out that's new, especially in the Supreme Court. That's a very good way of keeping up to date, and I think you can get an RSS feed from there as well. Black letter law is easier to check, especially when you're teaching it, because that actively engages you in discussion at the edges of corporate governance law. But finding a bit more difficult to understand how you measure and know you're applying things like ethical standards and professional responsibility. I guess one answer is that you're not being sued, but that's probably not the right answer. So I'm going to have to think more about this. I think it definitely requires peer interaction, and in those areas the value of the group learning is really good, as long as it's not reinforcing bad behaviour. So if anyone's got any ideas out there on how to better do that and measure that, that would be very useful. So turning to the skills, as you said, they're very difficult to isolate and demonstrate. But one thing that I have got into the habit of, and that's the result of mediation training over many years, is to reflect on interactions. And that reflection I do in writing. I've got a template. I do that on every formal negotiation and mediation. It's just become a habit, and it works really well. So I look at what interventions worked, some things you think will work and they don't work in a different setting, and so I consider why it didn't work and what I could have done to make it work better. And in that process, I usually also develop interventions that I might be able to use for the next time, so I've got it up my sleeve. And so I've developed a range of interventions that assist, and that's not just, of course, in mediation, but negotiation and board dynamics it works very well on. So that's a continuous loop, and that's one way of just making sure you're developing and thinking about the skills. Again, it should be interactive to get the best out of it, and maybe I could adapt this to other areas, but any suggestions are very welcome. So that's my thoughts, Neil. I'm going to have to think much harder on that.
Well, I think you've thought pretty hard already, and it's been very interesting to listen to you talk about your goals for your learning, the challenges that you face in undertaking it, and the many choices you've had to make in becoming clear about how to engage yourself in the learning process. I think that that's very useful. I hope that colleagues around the country who are listening today and getting ready perhaps to ask some questions have gained from that reflection that you've offered us. I think it might be useful, before we go on to the questions from around the country, if we did a little recap of the key things that we learned. First of all, there was a clarification of the nature of the New Zealand scheme and the CPD PR. We looked at examples from the practice of a variety of lawyers in New Zealand and learned from them how they seized the opportunity to make the most of CPD. They used networking, group discussions, planning, paying attention to what they learn as they learned it, being really conscious and intentional and aware, and having clear ideas of what they want to gain. They knew what their needs were, and they went out and sought to fill them. And I think you did the same, Christine. In fact, you did it on a very ambitious scale, and it's a wonder that you could undertake that much learning and carry out all of what you're doing. And it may be that one of the things to do is to focus on fewer things more deeply. You sharpened your sights on a lot of things to learn, and I think you have helped us understand how to diagnose learning needs, how to identify the gaps, how to find out what's really needed, how to plan for them, to think through specifically what you want to learn so that you can check to see whether you've actually learned it, to undertake a process of learning and planning that and thinking about it as you're learning it, and then using some sort of device, a checklist, if you will, of the things that you sought to learn and the extent to which you actually learned them. And then, because learning is a cyclical and ongoing process, start again. You know, it's a never-ending, and once engaged, a practitioner who learns to learn successfully, learns to love the learning process, will be engaged in it in a very intentional way for the rest of their, not just their careers, the rest of their lives. So I bet we have some questions out there from people. We'll do our best on both ends of this call in Vancouver, British Columbia, and in Wellington, New Zealand, to answer those questions. And I think it's back to Ken to help us moderate this. Ken?
Yes, thank you very much, Neil. And we do indeed have a number of questions from around the country. And thank you to participants for putting up, I guess, with a little bit of interesting feedback every now and then, the complexities of two countries talking at once. We do have a number of questions. Some of them are directly related to the CPD rules, and others will be directed to yourself, Neil, and you, Christine. The first one, and it comes up a lot, and I'll take it on board to answer this one, is the question is, I have held a practice certificate, but I have not provided regulated services, nor have I been available to practice as a lawyer in this last CPD year. And the question is really, do I have a requirement to make a CPD declaration? Now, I get this a lot, and so let's make it very clear. Regardless of your CPD requirement, if you hold a practice certificate, you must make a declaration, even if your hourly requirement is actually nil. So the CPD rules, in effect, are linked to you as a practicing lawyer with a certificate. Now, the second question is probably one for you, Christine, I think. Now, there are a number of you out there who give back to the profession, which is wonderful, in preparing and delivering seminars and various course material to other lawyers, which is fantastic. And the question is, how many hours do I actually count towards my CPD requirement? Christine.
Thanks. Oh, that's great. I think there's nothing like teaching it to learn it myself, so I think it's a really good way of upskilling yourself. For the delivery of presentations, of course, the entire delivery time is formal structured CPD, and also preparation time. Now, that's just a matter of professional judgment, really. So normal rule of thumb I take is about double the presentation time. But of course, if you're doing the same presentation time and time again, you really should only count it once. Again, it's a professional call because you're always adding to it, I know, but that's very much a professional judgment, Ken.
Thanks, Christine. Now, another question that's come in, and actually, Neil, this could be one for you, sir, is do I actually record all my learning activities? So this practitioner is saying, look, I do a lot more. This person's saying that they do well over 40 hours a year. You know, do I have to be recording all of this? What are your thoughts on that, Neil, from education and value point of view, I guess?
I think, Ken and Christine, that the way to approach this is not so much by the amount that's recorded in the number of hours of work that's been undertaken, but rather by the degree and the care in the reflection process. So rather than recording all 40 hours, pick 10 or so, or 15 if you want, and really think hard about what you learned, how it helped, what the gaps are that still remain, how you will apply it, how it can be useful, in what ways will it help you not only solve problems but work more effectively with clients and build confidence between you and the client. So I would say it's not so much quantity as quality. That's the old saw. And I would like to encourage every practitioner, including the one asking the question, to do that. Now, if this person is highly motivated and is keen to reflect upon all 40 hours with great care and consideration and can find the time and energy to do it, more power to her or him.
Thank you, Neil. And I guess this relates to the, well, connects with the next question from a practitioner in the South Island saying, well, how much do I actually have to write for my reflections as part of my plan. And perhaps I'll take this one. And, you know, Neil, you partially answered it. It's about quality, I guess, rather than quantity. But most lawyers have told me they're finding it's about writing comments that actually not only capture the learning, but are full enough that they can make sense of them later on when you come back to it. And there's another question that's just come in now around how important is it to apply the reflective practice model to day-to-day work, and should this be part of the model? I guess the first part of an answer here is it is part of a model, the model already. CPD is designed to be part and parcel of what we do now in the legal profession. But Christine, how important do you think it is to apply a reflective practice approach to your daily work?
Well, I guess this is the you know, the real goal for any of us as practicing lawyers. Some people do it automatically really well, and every transaction they do, they learn something from. Every case they have, they learn something from. This is very much what I was talking about as the reflective practitioner in mediation. What did I do well? What did I do badly? How can I craft interactions that might work better in the future? So, and very much the model that the medical profession has had for years. For instance, most medical professionals have got a requirement for a formal reflective practitioner reporting back, and that's certainly something that is the aim for lawyers.
Thank you, Christine. Now, a question for Neil. I've got a question here. How narrow or wide do you feel is the scope of an effective CPD plan in regards to terms of practice areas? The question says, look, while cost effectiveness in terms of time and expense are always considerations, how far do you recommend going beyond the main practice areas? The question continues that obviously undertaking CPD in criminal law is important if you're in that area, but if you're not, maybe less so. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the key is to always be choosing the area that you feel you have a great need for, that will have an impact on the quality of your work, both efficiency and effectiveness, that will improve the results for clients and the consequences to them of your work. And again, it's not a matter of how many areas of practice, so much as picking the ones that make the most sense for you and really digging in deeply. Having said that, I'm not aware of this individual person's practice, and I don't know what the variety of needs may be, and it may be a fairly general practice, and it may be important to pick something from each segment of practice to focus on, so that there's a kind of conscious building of knowledge, skill, and attitude as one works through these areas.
Thank you, Neil. Now, here's another one for you, and I guess this is related to study groups and your thoughts on the value of that. Question asking, look, if we set up a study group and watched a relevant, say, TED talk, or had a discussion around something that was really important to us, I mean, obviously it will be compliant with CPD activities if there's the element of interaction. But in your experience, how valuable can these study sessions be?
Well, I think they're tremendously motivating if the group is balanced and there's a kind of diversity of competencies in the room, of capabilities, of knowledge. And it doesn't have to be people of all the same level of experience, because I think an interchange among and between practitioners at various levels can be very useful. I'd say there are a couple of things that you have to really think consciously about when you form a group. One is, what do you hope to get out of it? What are the specific learning outcomes that you want to get from it? What are the gaps that you need to fill? What are the needs that you perceive? And how do you see the group helping you do that? Will you structure problems or specific points and questions to bring forward? Will there be a group facilitator? Will the group itself engage in a process of deciding what it wants to accomplish with the time it has available, so that it's not just a session that goes anywhere that it goes because of the way the conversation occurs, but rather that it's focused on the learning needs of each individual and of the group. And if you can merge those two so that insofar as there is a relatively even emphasis between individual need and group need, then there's going to be high motivation among all members of the group to do things. Now, it's also possible to identify different roles for different people in the group so that you don't just come together and say, well, what are we going to do about this now? Each person takes on a gap for leading the discussion. This can be the exchange of leadership within the group. A facilitator can be there just to make sure that the conversation doesn't bog down. So I suppose what I'm saying here again is be very conscious, plan carefully, know what you're seeking to accomplish, and get a commitment not only from yourself but from members of the group that you will engage in a process that is structured and sensible in achieving those ends. It's not just a matter of saying, oh, that was a great TED Talk, what do you all think about it? The TED Talk will have had a design, it will have had a key set of learning points. You can probably identify those ahead of time from a viewing of the first minute or two of the TED Talk ahead of time, then structuring the learning, showing the talk, and engaging in a process that deals with the structured learning. I hope that wasn't too long.
No, that's great, Neil. Thank you. Now, here's a couple of technical ones around the CPD rules. Now, someone's asked, I understand CPD points can no longer be carried forward past the first 2 years of the CPD requirements. Now, I just want to make it very clear for people that everyone out there, if you do in excess of the minimum number of hours, which is normally 10, then you can carry up to 5 hours forward into the next CPD year. So it's very important for that, that we understand that. Now, again, just related to the actual technical parts of the rules, we've had one question around, well, I guess it links to self-auditing organisations. And the question's around, look, at our firm, we already have a detailed career pathway. We've got lots of competencies, progression criteria, key performance indicators, training pathways. Look, how do we align this CPD with this existing program? And I guess the answer is fairly straightforward. You can. Aside from the fact that the rules are very flexible themselves, many organisations out there have either considered or are currently a self-auditing organisation. So what that means is that they're taking responsibility for ensuring the compliance, if you like, around the CPD requirements, but they're actually using the framework to mesh in with what they've already got in place. They're not necessarily reinventing the wheel, they're just meshing in the parts of the CPD rules that perhaps aren't part already of their performance management systems. Now, building in the reflective aspect of the CPD rules into how you do your performance management may actually be very valuable. It would help with staff's focus on the position of the firm in terms of where it's up to in its own learning or organisational goals, and as we've touched on today, might actually get a little bit of cross-chatter and cross-fertilisation of ideas within the organisation. So perhaps that's very valuable. Now, Christine, we have another question here for you, and I'll just let you read out this one so people don't get sick of my voice.
Right, so what would you recommend to do if you can't find formal learning opportunities to address skills-based focus areas that you have identified? Well, yes, sometimes it can be difficult, and sometimes you have to do something every couple of years because conferences and things only occur in that time frame, and they're also expensive to go to, so it's quite good finding some other ways. I would be saying one of the things that I found quite useful is to get a group of like-minded people together and perhaps choose someone as an expert to lead you in thinking and discussion. This can happen online. I certainly know of a group in Auckland who did this for mediation skills building. They got an expert in mediation to lead them on some reflections, and they do that monthly by teleconference or Skype. And that works really well. It needs to be, of course, structured, so you know what you're doing. You've got to do your objectives and things. The brochures tell you how to do that, but there's plenty of opportunities like that, and why not sort of put it out there with the local branch of the Law Society? Is there anyone else interested? And they can escalate it. There's always someone interested. And in fact, on that topic, there's a question that's come in particular about te reo, and there's a group of lawyers out there who say that they specialise in issues relating to Māori, and there's not many conference or other opportunities for formal learning, actually, with Māori litigation. And there are a few of those pieces of litigation, so few of those seminars available. I know there have been some round, and in fact, it may be that with that firm, we look at the firm itself doing some presentations or leading some thought in the area, and that would be very, very useful. So there's always some way of making sure that you hone in on your skills. There's another question in the same vein. I was very surprised to see that Christine used a tikanga and te reo course for CPD. I work in-house and attend seminars at work that are relevant to general staff and help me in court to have a better understanding of the files. Would this count as relevant CPD? For example, I recently attended a presentation on the process of manufacturing methamphetamine, which is useful in understanding drug charges laid in court. So would this count? Ken?
Yeah, look, there are a number of areas outside of black letter law, I guess, that you can count for CPD. This question, as well as a number of others in front of me, sort of touch on the same thing. To what degree can my learning come from other areas of interest to me? Now, I think this comes up a lot when I talk to practitioners. So I guess I want to highlight that CPD was designed to be really flexible for you. And the whole point of this exercise is to say, at the end of it, look, I got something out of it. So if there is an activity that you have found of interest to you, you know that it's going to benefit you professionally, then engage in it. If that opens up some more questions to what you're going to learn next, to what skills perhaps you need to develop outside of the law, then that's fantastic. So we've had a number of lawyers around the country engaging in everything from public speaking right through to, believe it or not, animal husbandry. And all of those individuals could identify why the learning was important to them. And that's the key. What is your learning need? What's the value of that learning to you? If it's going to make your life easier, better, you find your work more interesting and add value that way, that's the reason to engage in learning. And we have another couple of questions here as well around points. And I think that it's really important just to touch on the fact that the CPD rules, we don't have points as such, we have hours. We're asking that we engage in a minimum of 10 hours. In terms of what contact time do I count, which is a question here, it is about the contact time that you have in that learning space. So we're probably not counting the lunch hour, but we'll certainly be counting the interaction in the course.
So related to that was a question about how to count the te reo course that I'm going to be doing, and that's actually very easy because it's an educational institution, so they've given formal objectives and learning outcomes, and they talk about those and tie the whole course to it. But they have 2 hours a week of formal learning, and that amounts to 12 hours for the term. So I've got 12 hours of formal learning, which will count toward my CPD because it meets all the requirements. And just another thing that's coming through from the questions, quite a number of participants have said we thought we just had to go to Law Society courses, and that's never been the case, because the whole idea when we designed this, when Neil designed it, was that it would be easy and flexible, and it would actually address learning needs, not just some formal requirement where you had to notch off your hours. That was a really important thing. A lot of the overseas jurisdictions which have had CPD for a long time, it's just been 20 hours of their captured courses or approved courses, and it just hasn't hit the nail on the head. So Neil was very firm in his recommendations that it was a wide-ranging and diverse type of program that you could undertake. So there's also a question here that I'm going to throw at you, Ken.
Yes.
If we set up a study group at our firm and watched a relevant TED talk or something similar, and I interpolate, I presume it's not watching Suits on Netflix, and had a discussion about this, would it be compliant with CPD requirements?
Well, I think Neil's touched on this, but the focus really does need to be on the discussion, the value of what the learning was. Of course, bearing in mind that to start the CPD activity off, there need to be a formal focus for getting together to watch that talk. So bear in mind that when you are setting up study groups, it is important to ensure that you do have a clear learning focus for the time you're going to spend together. Now, it does bring up a question that's been posed, that I have a very specialised area of practice and I find it very hard to plan each year. Can a plan be repeated in multiple years? Well, I guess there's two parts to this question. Firstly, if you do have a very specialised area of practice, I would imagine that your planning becomes even more essential, and it may be that the study group option that we've touched on this morning becomes very important. Now, you don't have to be, obviously, in the same room to participate in a study group. It may well be that you know of 2 or 3 colleagues around the country who are in the same area. Perhaps a webinar, a Skype conference, talking on the phone would be really helpful to address your learning needs in that context. Can you repeat a plan across multiple years? I guess the answer to that is really up to you. Have your learning needs shifted? And if not, then by all means. But as Neil highlighted, it's always a good idea to say, what next? Go deeper, ask more probing questions. Neil, do you have any comments further on that?
Yes, I'm in agreement totally with you, Ken. The idea might be to have a plan that is a 3-year plan, but to assess it at the end of each year and revise it in accordance with that assessment. That's the nature of this process, is because hopefully in year 1 you will have accomplished some piece of it, maybe not as much, maybe more than you'd expected, and as a result you will need to revise the plan for the coming year. In a sense, you're revising the 3-year plan. You could keep a 3-year plan going all the time, always have a 3-year plan, so that you have another year 1 in what is the second year. But it's critical in this model that the practitioners see exactly what she has learned, what she hasn't learned, how it's going to be helpful, and what more needs to be done.
Thank you, Neil. That's really excellent. Now, look, our time for questions is finished, but I just want to point out, and I know I've talked to a number of you over the years around CPD, but if you do have any questions, please contact me. I'm always happy and willing to help if I can, and I know that some of you out there will have not had your questions answered this morning, so please make contact with me directly and I'll absolutely assist you. Now, I said at the beginning I'd mention around this material being archived. Now, before we get on to that, of course, a big thank you to Neil and Christine Christine, I'm just going to hand over to you very quickly for a little wrap-up and thank you before I go over the archiving of the materials.
Ka pai, Ken, and look, thanks for the questions. We got a lot out of those, and certainly there are some really interesting ideas for those firms with specialist skills. I'd be really interested in hearing from you and seeing what we can do for you. And Neil, thank you so much. Some of those answers have got me thinking as well. Ken, back to you.
Okay. So this webinar has been recorded, of course, and you can access an archived copy of the presentation by logging on to MyCPD through CLE. And further instructions on how to do that will be emailed to you shortly. Now, the same email will give you an electronic certificate of attendance for this, for your records. And at the same time, we'd really appreciate it if you could take a couple of minutes to complete the evaluation that is part of that, and let us know what you think of today's webinar. Look, Neil, Christine, thanks so much for such a fascinating presentation. I hope that lawyers out there have found it very valuable, and I appreciate your time.
Kia ora rawa atu, and thank you, Neil. Kia ora. This was a real masterclass.
Thanks, everybody.